Hello and welcome to The Drum Show, the weekly magazine show that aims to prove that marketing can change the world and that the world can change marketing. I'm senior reporter for tech at The Drum, Chris Sutcliffe. On this week's episode, we're going to be talking about the fallout from Roe v. Wade. We're going to be talking about what happens when figureheads begin to dictate the nature of a brand's reputation. And we're going to be talking about whether UK courts should be televised. So to discuss all that and more, I'm joined by a fantastic panel of guests, including Narita Bahra QC, Jasper Jackson, who is the tech editor at the Bureau for Investigative Journalism, and Gordon Young, who is, well, I suppose, the major domo at The Drum. So fantastic, thank you all for joining me. To begin with, though, we're going to our US editor and our US senior reporter, Ken and Kendra, who are going to take us through what's happened this week in and around Roe v. Wade.
Tell us a little bit first about, why this ruling is so profound, overturning this ruling would be so profound, and how agencies have responded so far, and what some of the trends you're seeing are.
Well, Roe v. Wade, as you mentioned, is of course the landmark Supreme Court case that in 1973 legalized abortion across the board in the United States. Of course, every state in the US has the ability to make its own abortion laws, but federally, everyone in the US has the right to an abortion. That is now put into question. The leak suggested that the court is poised to overturn Roe v. Wade. So there are a lot of implications here we can unpack. Firstly, you asked about agencies. That's a great question. 5 of the top 6 advertising holding companies have already promised to fund travel for employee abortion care following last week's leak. And some say they have provided the benefit for years. Omnicom, for example, told The Drum that it's paid for employees to travel for reproductive care since 2006. Others have just introduced increasingly comprehensive care following the news, including WPP, which told employees last week that it would be funding travel that allows for consistent access to healthcare and resources. So that means, again, if you live in a state that doesn't have as comprehensive access to abortion, WPP will pay for its employees to travel across state lines to receive the care that they need. Only one top holding company has not yet made a public statement. That's Havas. They have indicated that they are working on updating a policy. So agencies have been pretty forthcoming. I think it would be good to talk about brands because on the brand side, things have been a little bit more muddled.
To your point, we've already seen that, at least one leading PR agency has instructed their clients not to get involved. We saw the ramifications of what happened with Disney when they started to talk about politics in their region, and there were political ramifications that could be the subject of an entire other session. But, let's talk a little bit about how have brands reacted or not reacted so far.
Largely speaking, brands are really hesitant to weigh in on this issue. Obviously, it's a very sensitive and divisive political issue. A few notable brands have been pretty bold. Yelp, Bumble, Ben & Jerry's, and Match Group's OkCupid have all published statements staunchly defending Roe v. Wade and also, similar to many of the agencies, clarifying new healthcare policies for their own employees. However, the larger trend is in the opposite direction. Many more companies are choosing to stay silent. What is somewhat surprising, as you mentioned, is that there are a handful of brands, including Amazon, Salesforce, Dell, Lyft, and others that last year, for example, opposed some restrictive state-level abortion laws, including Texas's SB 8, the so-called heartbeat bill, and at that time announced a number of updated healthcare policies to expand reproductive care access for employees, but are now choosing to remain mum on Roe v. Wade and the leaked Supreme Court draft. So it should be interesting to keep an eye on how brands are navigating this space as the situation develops. Another point I wanted to raise is that last week, Politico collaborated with Morning Consult on a study that indicates that over half of registered US voters support when brands speak out about abortion access. It's 51%. However, of course, it's also worth noting that opinions differ significantly across party lines. While 76% of Democrats say that they support when companies speak out on abortion, only 28% of Republicans feel the same way. So it's kind of no surprise that brands are worried about alienating parts of their consumer base and are probably trying to figure out what the best next move is.
So obviously some fascinating stats there, particularly around what the public wants to see brands engage with when it comes to moral and political stances. So we saw there was a huge amount of polarization in terms of who wants brands to engage with this sort of stuff. So Jasper, to begin with then, what do you think are the arguments in favor of brands actually taking a stand?
So I think there are actually two two key aspects here, particularly with this piece of legislation, actually because it affects women's reproductive rights. Actually, there's no way that this isn't to do with brands. There's no way you don't interact with women. And a really good example of this that's actually really relevant to the advertising industry is obviously the use of data potentially to target women and persecute or harass women who try and access things like Planned Parenthood. That's an issue. We've already seen people be able to buy data on where people are visiting. That's an example of how this just affects companies, and you can't get away from that. My personal opinion is that basically it's perfectly reasonable for people to expect their brands to express a position on something that is so important, so vital, and then make their purchasing decisions based on that. And I don't see anything wrong with it. I understand that some brands might think there's a downside to taking sides on this, but I think generally if you look at the overarching stats, most brands will probably find that if they actually express pro-abortion views, more customers are likely to actually purchase from them than leave them.
So there's a corollary to that, which is kind of the performance of ESGs. And Gordon, I think we were talking about Unilever beforehand and, say, BlackRock Group, which have made social and corporate responsibility part and parcel of their selling point. But to what extent then do you believe that that corporate responsibility to shareholders does then extend into taking a stand on issues like abortion?
I think it's very difficult. I think it depends on what sort of brand you are. So if you're operating in, say, for example, the women's health market, it would be relevant to sort of maybe an express opinion on this issue. But I think if you're Unilever or in an ice cream industry, I don't think it's really relevant to ice cream. I don't think people care if their ice cream is pro-choice or not. They just want good ice cream. The other thing that's really changed, I think, the environment's got a lot more dangerous for brands venturing into these areas because the populations in the US and UK have got a lot more polarised because of Trump, because of Brexit. There's definitely a lot more polarisation going on. So maybe 10 years ago, when there seemed a lot more consensus, it was sort of safe to sort of express views and all sorts of things which weren't related to the brand. Suddenly, I think it's got a lot more dangerous. So I think the advice to that PR company is probably quite good. Stay out of it if you possibly can.
There's another aspect to this discussion, which is the fact that we're talking about opinions and people's kind of moral stances, which are very subjective. But to what extent then are we dealing in absolutes? For instance, Roe v. Wade is based on sort of a bit of a leaked document rather than anything hard and fast.
Well, yes, so being a lawyer, I'm going to be prudent about this. The reality is the judgment has not come out yet. So if I was in a department for any big company, I would be saying, firstly, you don't actually know what they're going to rule. We know the leaked document says that Roe versus Wade was egregiously wrong, but the difficulty with that is, as a brand, before anything has been said, do you actually want to come out and say that that particular piece of legislation is wrong? Because you might not understand it, the public might not understand it, you're politicising your firm. What you could do, if you wanted to, was just simply put out a message to say that every woman has the right to choose. But then again, in the current climate, is that something you really want to get involved in? Because the moment you do, you're going to be on the front page of the newspaper saying this company is making a decision. Some people may take the view that they'll just wait and see. And if you were the lawyer for those big companies, you would be telling them to wait and see.
Oh, absolutely, and we've seen so many brands over the last couple of months take a very strident stance on issues around sort of the Ukraine war, now around Roe v. Wade. But to what extent then are we expecting them to just take a very top-level stance on this and almost say, we believe that this is wrong? And what then does that offer to audiences, to consumers who want to align their purchasing power with brands that share their values?
It's the classic one when you talk about ESGs and corporate social responsibility. A lot of the time, brands will say things publicly and then fail abysmally to actually support the ideals and morals underneath them, and that's fundamentally a bigger issue for and should be the biggest issue for consumers, and also should be the biggest issue for brands. So I think the bigger picture there is always they've got to try and actually live up to their statements, which a lot of the time, people like BlackRock, for instance, occasionally might say a lot, big talk on the environment, but as the Bureau's shown, possibly say some slightly different things behind the scenes.
Yeah, and also the most socially responsible thing any business can do is to actually make a profit. Because if it makes a profit, it's going to be sustainable, it'll create employment, it's going to contribute to the tax base. I do worry. I mean, I do, on one hand, I should say, believe that doing good can be good business. So I do get it. But I'm concerned that I think some companies have been distracted to the point where they're losing sight of their core proposition. Unilever, for example, has been criticised because there's a sense that they're spending so much time on social purpose. they're forgetting the real social purpose, which is making a return for the shareholders and making the business sustainable. And I think that's an example of a company that's maybe gone a bit too far. Obviously, Ben & Jerry's is part of that group. They don't have a lot of control over Ben & Jerry's because of the weird way it is bought. But I think, Ben & Jerry's is an example of a division that I think Unilever are trying to sell at the moment, but they're having difficulty selling it because of the political stance that brand's taking.
Do you think that there's a lot of companies are feeling pressured to look at the social and political responsibility side when actually they could just simply move forward by taking a neutral stance on everything and just saying, this is the product we sell. We don't want to be political.
Yes, and I think there's a lot of pressure from like Unilever and any company now. There's a lot of pressure internally as well from staff who don't just want to be doing commerce all the time. They actually do want they want higher purpose. And so you can understand where the pressure is coming from. But I think there's a danger it can become a bit of a distraction from the business.
Is it possible to not take a political stance, to be neutral? We saw from Kendra that sort of 71% of Republicans would prefer that brands didn't necessarily weigh in on Roe v. Wade. But is that not itself a political stance?
I'd argue that one of the joys of the internet, and I spend too much time on Twitter and social media generally, and I realise how toxic and often pretty horrible it is. But I'd say actually one of the joys of it is there is a certain degree of democratisation in which there is interaction, there is engagement in issues from people on the internet who will express their views. And to some extent, I'd also argue that we've seen when we're talking about people within companies. I cover the tech industry, and you look at Facebook and some of the good moves Facebook has made to actually attempt to, what limited moves those are, to deal with some of the problems that take place on that platform, have come directly from within Facebook employees. And Facebook didn't care until their own employees started rebelling. I think both the online pressure that people face and also internal company pressure is often a force for good, and is the thing that's stopping people being able to avoid taking a stance on these subjects.
But isn't there a difference between if you sell a product and if you sell a service? So let me give you an example. You sell a product, you sell trainers, and you say, okay, we want women to buy these trainers, so we're going to take a view and say we are pro-abortion. You sell a service, I'll give you an example, you're a lawyer. Do you actually want to say, I want to take a view on this? Because your client, your next client, you may have lost them. So and you might not lose them this week, you might not lose them this month, but when somebody looks at your social media 3 years down the line, you're then alienating a market. So doesn't it depend on what you're selling?
Personally, I probably don't think so, because I think you have to make decisions based upon what kind of clients you want.
What about if you stay neutral? Why can't you stay neutral?
But I agree. I think that if a brand is going to take a stand, it's got to be authentic. And so ideally the brand should be taking a stand on things that directly affect that brand. So if you're a dairy business, you can campaign for sustainable farming. If you're a legal practice, you can campaign for just more open justice to law. That makes sense. But when you start wandering off and take strong views on areas which aren't really anything to do with your brand, I think that's where it could be a difficulty.
And the thing I'd say on this one is that I don't think any brand is unaffected by Roe v. Wade, and for instance, I don't think any brand is unaffected by climate change. And to say they're not,
but Roe v. Wade has to be something the American political system needs to sort out. And so America, it's a complex democracy. It's obviously a flawed democracy. But sometimes you just need to stand back and let democracy run its course. And sometimes democracy is not going to deliver results I agree with, or a brand agrees with. But that is just the way democracy works. And I think that the brands aren't really there to be political parties. Brands are there to provide specific services. And I do think it maybe gets in the way.
I agree, it probably does make things more complex, at least for the leaders on any of these organisations, but I think they're not going to be able to avoid it in the future.
But Jasper, why not wait? The Supreme Court are going to make a ruling, and when that ruling comes out, there will be a definitive answer for everybody, and people can process that answer and then decide what side of the line they fall on. Why would I, as a company, want to take a view about a decision that I don't really know what the outcome is? Why can't I wait 2 weeks? Why can't I wait a month till I know what I'm doing?
This is actually an interesting thing. It's partly about the broader environment around this, that someone leaked that. Someone leaked that draft for a purpose.
Right.
in order to win a PR battle.
Yeah.
This is a PR battle, and that's where the company's statements actually play a role. This isn't just a legal battle, it's not even just a political
But
battle.
why should I, as a company, feel pressured into joining in that PR battle? Why can't I wait?
Because if you don't join it now, then you aren't actually impacting the end result.
But you know what, in a sense, we're all being manipulated.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
So
sure.
this is based on a marketing campaign.
Yeah.
Someone's deliberately leaked this to cause this sort of
why
row.
should we all join in now? Why can't we sit back and wait and join in a month's time? It doesn't damage my brand to wait.
It sounds like we're talking about timescales here, because on issues like Roe v. Wade, obviously you need to wait. You can have a very top level stance and say, well, look, we are pro-choice, we are, anti-abortion. But on something like climate change, when there is scientific consensus, you have to be seen to kind of planting your flag in the sand, I think. But beyond that, so much of what we think of as a brand purpose or that kind of brand mission is predicated on who its figureheads are. So, for instance, Tesla is, on the face of it, a very environmentally friendly company. At least that's some of their stated aims. But Elon Musk, who's recently mooted a kind of takeover of Twitter, is a darling of the right wing in the US. They obviously push back against, they are kind of hesitant to engage with any climate change dialogue. So to what extent do we think that brands their purposes are predicated solely on their CEOs, their figureheads?
I think one of the interesting things, particularly about Elon and other tech leaders, is that because of the way our culture views them, and also because these companies are, lots of them are shedding huge amounts of money now. Google and Facebook are hugely profitable, huge revenues, but a lot of the culture around this is actually on valuations, and this is very much the case with Tesla. Tesla is a very interesting business, but I mean its fundamentals are a bit weird. But it's valued so incredibly highly, and that's why Musk is very rich, and that's how he's able to fund the supposed Twitter takeover. And so I think it's very much a thing about Silicon Valley, actually, that you really do get in these kind of businesses, the figurehead becomes incredibly important, not just to the way the company reacts, not just to its brand, but also to its market cap. And that's one of the reasons why someone like Musk is actually so important, and also makes the company's stock so volatile.
So you get those kind of the demagogues of these companies who are then kind of indelibly tied to not just the company's purposes, but it's also its corporate performance. So in this kind of new age where we do have those celebrity CEOs and figureheads, is there even a division anymore between brand purpose and what the company does, how it operates, what its values are?
It's interesting, it's such a double-edged sword. So you get these like Elon Musk and Richard Branson, the Brewdog founder of what's his name?
James Watt.
James Watt. These businesses are all quite well known because they don't invest a lot in advertising. So they use their founders as a sort of massive PR machine. And it can work really, really well. I mean, Tesla has got a higher valuation than every other car company combined. Whatever way you look at it, he has been remarkably successful. And that is down to the force of his personality. The danger you have, though, is when it goes wrong and people are caught up in a scandal. I think Brewdog have had quite a hard time because of the nature of the complaint with whistleblowers within Brewdog suggested that they haven't behaved very well to the employees. Then that can sort of be dangerous. It's a double-edged sword.
And also, I mean, one of the things, particularly with Elon, other tech people, particularly with Musk, is that he's come in with this set of aims for Twitter that he says he's going to put in place, bringing Donald Trump back, removing permanent bans, complying with laws around the world, etc. But if you actually talk to any of the people who've engaged in trying to keep Twitter a vaguely okay place to exist, which is the core of the business, they actually say that it's just really, really complex.
Yep.
And the thing is, Musk just thinks he's really good at fixing anything.
Yeah.
And that's partly because he's got an ego, which is how you build these kind of brands.
But do you not think the issue is when you say keep Twitter a vaguely good place, you mean where most of the people are saying stuff you agree with?
Not at all.
Because I'm sort of sympathetic to the idea that Twitter should be
The Wild West, effectively, of...
not necessarily. It should be a neutral. It should be a neutral platform. It should be a town square. I think they were wrong to permanently ban Donald Trump, and I think they were definitely wrong to take down the New York Post. So there are two examples where I think Twitter got it badly wrong. And if an ownership model comes in and say, actually, we are going to protect a bit of freedom of speech, I don't think that's a bad thing.
It's all bound up, though, in the fact there are responsibilities for what social media platforms publish on their site, and so much of it is now indelibly linked to what their users post. So, for instance, Trump was banned from Twitter because he violated terms of service around actually inciting violence. Now, that's not something you can easily walk back, because that is a fact, that did happen. So to what extent, then, do we think that this is brands almost trying to protect themselves, and this must
we come back to your
upend
figureheads
that?
point. So on the one hand, and if we use Musk as an example, on the one hand, we've got him being very environmentally friendly, and everybody who wants to Save the Environment wants to have an electric car, so they buy into that.
I mean, he also launches rockets, which aren't very
Yeah,
environmentally friendly.
and then today we had the announcement that he would bring Donald Trump back. That one figurehead is their opinions effectively become the company, and I think that's the danger.
It's danger, yeah.
It's absolutely dangerous for a company to have just one individual who's portrayed to be the company, because one little swing that way, as you say, is so volatile, and the shares can be up, the shares can be down, depending on one little decision.
As of this morning, in fact, as of the time of recording, a judge in the US has ruled that Musk is effectively liable to shareholders for announcing ahead of time on Twitter that Tesla could be taken public. And so now there is the implication that shareholders might have legal recourse for how Musk's one tweet impacted the stock of Tesla. But beyond that, we've seen that, we're talking about figureheads becoming indelibly linked to the brand. And obviously, Dior has received opprobrium and also praise from both sides of the agenda for keeping Johnny Depp, who is embroiled in a domestic violence trial with ex-wife Amber Heard. But they've kept him on as their spokesman for their Savage brand. So I wondered, what extent do you think that we should be able to just kind of say, actually, you know what? Brands can wash their hands of whoever they want. Companies can just say, no, we're out.
It's your brand.
Exactly, yeah.
It's your brand. If you think about it this way, if you employed someone in your company and they did something that you thought was completely fitted gross misconduct, you would get rid of them because you didn't want them associated with your company.
Also, you're allowed, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you're allowed to, fire someone for bringing your company into disrepute.
Absolutely.
That is a completely different thing.
And they will have a very detailed contract about what they can and can't do as an ambassador of that particular brand. And so what is wrong with the company saying, actually, if we go back to the first point we were discussing about Roe and Wade, about becoming involved and taking a social responsibility stance, what is wrong with somebody saying, actually, as a company, we don't stand by this at all. So until this is resolved, I'm afraid you're going to have to step away from our company, because what that shows is social responsibility.
Yeah,
it's fascinating. It's very unusual for a brand to sort of stand by something like Johnny Depp.
We've seen so many examples of that, but I think
it would make it much easier.
But
absolutely.
Actually, why should the company step back from him? Because if you think about it, now what's happening in the next sort of phase is actually, I think he's going to come out of these televised proceedings very, very well. And I think he's going to regain public sympathy. So the problem is there's certain words and issues that basically make people very, very emotive. And one of them is domestic violence. People don't wait to see what the actual facts are. Once the allegation is made, sexual assault, etc., there's no smoke without fire, and people assume there must be some substance.
Absolutely.
Well,
which is obviously why it's cancelled by Pirates of the Caribbean.
Oh yeah, of course.
So they moved quite fast to kick him off that series.
The flip side of this is, if you go on TikTok, there is a huge army of Johnny Depp fans who are not waiting to find out the answer either. They're just convinced that he's innocent.
Did there come a time that you tape recorded Mr. Depp on this plane?
I want to sit here and say that I was telling myself I needed to leave him, but as he got worse, he demanded the oxygen tank from the flight attendant, excuse me, and he continued to drink, and then eventually started howling like an animal and passed out in the bathroom with the door locked.
Well, this leads very neatly on to our final topic of the day, which is the almost compare and contrast between what's going on in the Depp-Heard case in the US versus what's happening in the UK with Coleen Rooney and Rebekah Vardy.
Oh no, they've gone the wrong way. Nick, lean in.
Nick, come in.
Oi, mate.
Nick.
Please. Get out of the way.
Nick.
Excuse me.
So in the US, we've seen almost the memeification of the Depp-Heard trial. We've seen people on TikTok mocking Amber Heard's testimony, which is publicly accessible through Court TV. Meanwhile, in the UK, where reporting restrictions are in place around courts, we've seen effectively people disseminating information through Twitter based on kind of very little half-heard snapshots almost of what they've heard across social media. So to what extent then do we think that the US system of actually televising this has unintended consequences, is a benefit to the public understanding these?
Just generally, if one looks at what are the advantages of actually having criminal proceedings or civil proceedings being televised, I think the first thing is the public don't understand how lawyers operate, especially in the UK. So it will educate them, it will allow them to have an insight, and it will allow them to take some knowledge away from how the system operates and have some confidence in it themselves. But the flip side is this, that there are a legal case, especially a civil legal case, is paper-based and it's very, very complex. So what you hear in court is a snapshot of what's going on. And actually, unless you're a lawyer, or you're somebody who sits through the whole proceedings, you're never really going to understand everything. And what's happening at the moment is it's becoming sensationalised, and the media involvement is actually resulting in people looking at what they were wearing. I mean, the newspapers are looking at what they were wearing, what blazer they were wearing, what handbag they were wearing, how they walked in, not at what they were saying. You know, the only bit of documentation I saw this morning was about whether or not somebody said the word "fuck" in court.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, that isn't actually what we're there for. So it almost makes it into a joke. So why not make it a meme?
Yeah, I suppose at that point, if you're inviting it through that secrecy, through that lack of transparency, you have to expect that people will focus on some of those superficial details. But then, Gordon, what do you think in terms of actually making sure that the public does stay informed? I know you've had experience in sort of Scottish courts.
My sort of default would be, I think the courts in the UK should be televised. There's obviously all sorts of dangers. But I don't think they're insurmountable. I remember the controversy over televising the House of Commons. People were worried a lot of the same issues.
And now it's on Twitch.
It works really well, and I do think televising the House of Commons has helped people understand how the Commons works, and has got insight into into that process. We used to run a legal magazine up in Scotland called The Firm, and I was always shocked at really how the lack of understanding of the legal process, and also the quality of the legal process as well. We actually once ran a survey where we just went out to try and find the top judges in Scotland. So we sent a questionnaire out to every QC in Scotland. Each judge in Scotland was rated by 15 QCs, which is the size of a Scottish jury. Thought that's fair enough. They're rated in things like clarity in court, understanding of the law, compassion, and then we published a league table from 1 to 13, because there's only 13 High Court judges. Now, I can't remember who number 1 was, but I definitely remember who was the worst judge in Scotland. He was very angry. He sent me the last.
You don't say, yeah.
He sent me the last letter I'd ever received, which was written on a typewriter. And you could tell he was angry because the letter's been wiped through the page. Basically, there was a lots of arguments between us. He took us to the Press Complaints Commission. We won a case. Yeah. And eventually he took early retirement. So I feel we contributed to getting that judge off the bench.
But Gordon, let me give you an example. Do you think televised proceedings should stop at civil proceedings, or they should extend to criminal cases? Because when a courtroom is operating, they are told not to discuss anything outside of that courtroom until they've concluded the case. So no documentation, none of the information goes out, so that a witness is told, you've given your evidence, do not discuss it with anyone until this case is concluded. Now, doesn't it make a mockery of it all if we televise, for example, criminal proceedings in the course of the proceedings?
It depends how you do it. I mean,
I don't think you can do it in a way.
You maybe wouldn't want to live stream it.
Justice.
But you maybe could do actually
it's an edited highlights almost
after the verdict.
Yeah, that may be. But I think, during a criminal case being televised, I mean, can you imagine somebody's watching it and they think, oh, I know all about that case. I think I'll turn up and tell Judge tomorrow.
Yeah.
obviously as a journalist, I quite like the idea of more transparency in the court system in many ways. Obviously, it's a trade-off between the principle of open justice and the need, and the need to ensure that your courts run effectively and you don't mess things up. I think the distinction between civil and criminal cases is one you'd probably really want to consider. I mean, again, you'll know more about this than me, but I imagine that witnesses might also be more intimidated from ever appearing if they knew that a trial was ever going to be live streamed. But I also think it's probably even more important to have the transparency that the public can see in civil cases, because if the way civil cases often, the really important ones, there often tends to be a huge amount of huge attempts to suppress the information that's going out, but because companies generally are the ones that can afford big lawyers and try and stop this stuff getting out. And I think those are probably actually the cases where transparency is in some ways even more important and potentially poses less of an issue.
Let me put this to you then, because in a lot of ways the IP of a trial extends beyond just the televising it. We see it in kind of across social media, people mocking some of Amber Heard, for instance. We see it in the dramatizations of trials after the fact. So The Staircase is currently airing. That is a Colin Firth starring dramatization of a documentary which was about a US court case about a man who was accused of murdering his wife. So to what extent then do we expect that the public can ever be truly informed about something if all they have to go on?
If they want to be informed, they can go along to court and sit in court and watch it.
Yeah,
that's the first, and then you'll get a proper 100% view of what's going on.
But nobody does.
Well, they can if they want. Nobody stops them in those cases.
And I think there's a lots of problems with courts. But basically, I think we need to find a way, the media needs to find a way of recording what's going on across more court cases. One thing I'd like to see reformed is this, rule that you can only take a shorthand note. Because I think that has meant there's fewer journalists who are qualified. I mean, even to find a journalist.
I have a difficulty with that, because why should a journalist be permitted to record in the courtroom but not a lawyer when they actually need the material?
There is a quite simple solution to this one, though. It's not charging huge amounts of money for court transcripts.
They don't really charge that much.
More than most local newspapers can ever afford.
£60 a day or £90
local
a day.
Newspapers can't afford that.
Local newspapers can't even afford, well, they cannot afford to spend. Yeah, exactly.
If there was more access to, even if there was more access to transcripts of what was going on, which could be redacted in ways that protect people, that would make a huge difference.
Well, they could do one every day, because the court record everything that happens, so they could just, as a matter of course, make one available.
That would be fine. That would make a huge difference.
Yeah.
Well, a tiny fraction of court cases in the UK are really reported on. I turned up at courts in Scotland and Hamilton Sheriff Court, and people are absolutely agog that there's a civilian there, somebody they didn't.
But you're right, they are recorded anyway. So everything that happens in a courtroom is recorded on a system. So if they were to produce a transcript every day and anyone could have access to that for free, that would actually be a really good suggestion.
The issue with that is, as we've mentioned, there is little interest from the public in some of these cases. There is huge public interest in reporting them.
It's not even that. The issue with it is this. Let's say you turn up on Monday and you say, I would like a transcript. That transcript falls into the wrong hands or in the middle of the trial. Your whole trial could be aborted because the transcript has fallen into the hands of the wrong person.
So why then are we...
The witness, or the witness has seen it in advance and knows what questions they're
I
going to
guess
get
the thing
asked.
is, there is some investment that would have to be made into the legal system in order to run it in a way, run that level of transparency.
There's a lot of investment that needs to be made into the legal system. The
In general,
government are not making it, and
This
that's
is one of the
why
things.
barristers at the moment are only working to rule.
It's one of the things about the court system. Not just. I know, obviously,
You need
in
to
terms
take that
of
up with the
amount of money you're
MOJ.
getting,
I will be behind you.
but the level of courts are so underfunded. In terms of tech. In fact, the idea of we're talking about televising this. I mean, the court system.
I mean, in a way, I wish they would, because the public could then see. You see, what we have is fat cat lawyers get paid lots of money and they don't want to go to court. Well, they should go to court and see we don't have a canteen. We don't get a bottle of water. We don't even get a jug like that anymore. We have to bring our own, and the system is dilapidated. So unless the public see how bad it is, they won't understand it. And the other thing for me is, because I do a lot of defence work, the case that's going on in America is really interesting. It's the best thing that could have ever happened to Depp. Because if he'd just had these proceedings and they were not being recorded, he would have been a man who'd been accused of domestic violence, and the public would have said, well, you know, the courts were in his favour and they ruled against him. This time the courts can see the witnesses give evidence, they can see how it's all been presented, they can see for themselves whether or not they think the complainant is a genuine one. And this is something that the public don't get to see normally.
Yeah.
But, you know, I welcome in that way, absolutely, because I think people need to see it. And I'd be the first to say, come and see my broken seat, you know, where my trousers get ripped because I can't sit down here and I'm going to fall down. I want people to see that.
Quick question, do you think if the libel trial, Depp's libel trial was televised in the UK, there might have been a different outcome?
No, because actually I think as a complainant, she's being proved to, there's substantial holes in her account. And I think if it wasn't televised, the general public view would be there is no smoke without fire. He's been charged with domestic violence, and maybe, you know, he had really expensive lawyers and they just managed to, you know, miraculously make it all go away. Whereas actually the public can see for themselves whether or not they think the complainant's substance, you know, there's any substance to what she's saying.
We could talk about that for hours and hours, but unfortunately we are coming right up into the end of time of this episode. Well, Narita, Jasper, Gordon, thank you so much for taking the time to come in and have this chat. We could have spoken about every single one of those topics for the rest of the day. But for now, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who's been watching. You can stick around on thedrum.com for more explorations of everything that we've spoken about and more articles about how marketing can change the world and in turn is changed by the world. But for now, thank you very much for watching and goodbye.